Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the government's seemingly bizarre strategy to refuse to even engage with pay talks with various unions, as nurses say they will call off their strikes. All the Secretary of State has to do is attend pay talks. Simple as that. If they want to avoid strikes this Christmas, no problem. All you have to do is attend talks. No other preconditions. And the government seemingly won't even do that. Are the Tories making a strategic error here, or perversely, does it actually help them achieve their aims? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So there are differences of approach between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, but in terms of their strategy with the largely public sector industrial disputes, they are taking exactly the same line. It's not just that they refuse to make an offer to at least reduce the scale of the real terms pay cuts that key workers are being asked to accept, but the government refuses to even engage in talks. Now, this seems odd to me because the government clearly have a strategy of getting voters to turn against the striking workers. You know, it's a very finely balanced PR game here. And it's also a clear part of their strategy to blame Labour for the strikes as well. This is why Starmer has been at pains to block off all such lines of attack. Nothing to do with me, saying, in case you hadn't noticed, you lot are in charge, you're the government, your problem. And surely it must be seen as literally the case when the government won't even engage. Like, if ministers attended talks, but just kept to their positions anyway, they could at least claim they were getting involved and they were trying, they were putting the effort in, they just weren't finding a way through. You know, they could at least explain to the public that they were making that effort. The Royal College of Nursing and Unison yesterday have offered to call off the Christmas and New Year strikes if Health Secretary Steve Barclay attends talks aimed at resolving the dispute. A deal is there to be had, we know that, from Scotland, and one that means accepting a real terms pay cut still. It's unfair that key workers are earning so much less than they were when the Conservatives came to power 12 years ago. But we know that they will accept another real terms pay cut. They just don't want the government completely taking the piss. You know, at the moment, people are struggling to even afford food and heating. You know, the reason for the above inflation pay demand is simply to allow the government to come to a reasonable deal and let ministers look like they struck a good bargain. But they're just not playing the game. Very hard to see how the public will side with the government when the government is not even pretending to try and avert the strikes. Instead of attending talks about pay, ministers would instead prefer to threaten legislation to make strikes more difficult. But as plenty have pointed out, if you stop people protesting peacefully and lawfully, you don't actually stop them protesting. You just turn the protests into something else. You know, the current wave of dissatisfaction in the public sector is born of the fact that they've not had real terms pay increases since the last recession. You know, we get recessions on a fairly regular basis, but before now, what would happen is workers would get some sort of real terms pay increase in between. So when the next recession came along, the real terms pay cut was cushioned by the previous years of pay rises, and the expectation that pay would go up again once the current recession was over. This didn't happen this time. The Tories, going right back to David Cameron, have just proceeded with reckless abandon. You know, they've squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and now there's nothing left. But are the Tories getting their strategy right or not? Normally, you would say there are two massive flaws in their plan. The first is that the government, you know, if they win, let's say they win, and these workers are forced to back down, all that happens is a load of them will leave the profession to take up higher paid work elsewhere. You know, we are facing a severe labour shortage in the UK right now. So public sector workers living in and around towns with high employment will find other jobs that they can do for more money. There might be some parts of the country where it's a bit trickier, but there are others where, in actual fact, there are jobs that they could just move to, depriving us of that public service. You know, that would cost our public services because there's already high shortages there. It's not just a case of that dissatisfied worker would go and someone would replace them. We can't get the workers as it is. But this is not a problem for the Tories, because they want that. They want nurses, doctors, firefighters, rail workers and others to go and find work elsewhere. Tories generally have a disdain for state-controlled public services, and they want them to collapse in order to promote the idea of having them all fully privatised. So this is not actually a flaw in their plan. It is at the very least a side benefit, potentially even a planned feature. The second potential flaw is in loss of public support. Now, support is a little bit sketchy, but polling has shown that the general public are more in favour of striking workers and unions than against them. You know, in the stream last night, I showed a poll for whether nurses should be able to strike or not. The proportion in favour and against was roughly the same for the past few years, but last month there was a sudden increase in support and a drop in the number against. Similar upturn in support for doctors and firefighters. Usually people's support for strikes tends to wobble a bit for emergency workers. You know, if like strikes are disruptive, people get that strikes are disruptive. If people have trouble, say, getting a train on a particular day, or they need to sort out childcare for their kids when teachers are on strike, that's a pain. But they do it. They just have to do it. But the public's goodwill tends to fold a little bit when it comes to workers who literally save lives. But this upturn in support indicates that people appreciate that key workers, including emergency service workers, are just facing unreasonable demands. But does it show that Tories are making a strategic error? Not necessarily. The fact that the strategy is both questionable but is pushed by both Johnson and Sunak, who are different types of Prime Minister, would suggest to me that their own strategists think that it is a good move. And as I've said before, you know, in a lot of contexts, the problem when you look at overall public opinion in polls is you can sometimes get the impression that a political party is making a mistake. Oh, this is really unpopular. Oh, they're making a terrible mistake there, when they're not at all. Because the fact is that the Tories don't care about overall public opinion, and strategically, nor should they. First past the post, overall public opinion matters naff all. What matters are, of those members of the public, which ones vote, because the ones who don't vote doesn't matter what their opinion is at all. And of those who do vote, it's their own voters, and particularly the swing voters who mean the difference between winning and losing an election. You know, when you look at the same poll for nurses, but only for Conservative voters, you can see way more against the idea of nurses striking. That being said, you can see that the gap has closed quite a bit. You know, I can't tell for certain, but it's quite likely, you would imagine, that the Conservative voters who changed their minds last month in favour of the nurses are more likely to be those moderate swing voters around the centre. That would make sense to me. So it could still be a mistake. If the core support is against the strikes, but the more unreliable Conservative voters are with the nurses on this one, then Sunak could still be making a big mistake. Unless, of course, the Tories' internal polling suggests that the increase in support for nurses going on strike amongst their former voters is in areas where it doesn't matter. It may be in areas that they've already agreed are going to have to abandon anyway. You know, if it's largely driven by voters in regions where the Conservatives don't win seats anyway. Like, what does it matter if they lose a few more Conservative voters in Liverpool, where they never win a seat anyway? Or where they think they don't stand much chance at the next election, like the Red Wall? Then arguably that doesn't matter. So in terms of what appear to be the two biggest flaws in the plan of the government's refusal to even sit down to talk, it is possible that it's not a strategic error at all on their part. Now that, of course, would make the job for the unions trying to help their members and save public services that they represent much tougher, and also means the general public will suffer more. That being said, I still don't think the government have seriously thought through the plan here. Despite his claims, Sunak could easily have come to agreements with the various public sector unions here. In fact, we know from recent news that the government actively blocked rail bosses from agreeing a deal with the RMT. So that's not even a case of the government not lifting a finger to stop the strikes. They've actively intervened. They've put effort in to keep one going. You know, the government clearly want these strikes. They want a battle that they think they can win. That's what they want. They want a battle that they think they can win. Maybe Rishi Sunak personally feels that in order to gain control of his party, second video today, I'll be interested on that one. There was a little bit of breaking news when I came out to record this. You know, maybe Sunak feels that he personally needs a battle that can get the Tory party on his side. Maybe that's what this is about, to distract from the various other problems coming this winter and to unite the naysayers within the party behind him. As well as strikes, Sunak does face the prospect of electricity blackouts, the worst winter crisis the NHS has ever known, as well as the usual Tory scandals flying around from his colleagues. It's like the government wants to keep the strikes going in order to provide some feeble opportunities to blame others. Or, like I said, in a battle to try and win so that he can get some of those, particularly to the right of his party, behind him. Because this has been a feature of the Conservatives in government, going right back to 2010, just blaming others. There was a time when some of them would at least accept responsibility. Blame is an intrinsic part of politics. You do blame others, you avoid taking blame yourself. Politicians convince themselves it's for the greater good. But that only works, it can only be justified, if they privately resolve to fix the problems behind the scenes. But we have a government who, since 2010, have not only sought to blame everyone else for their mess, but don't even privately acknowledge that they need to do something to help. So they still behave as if it is someone else's fault and therefore that someone else should deal with it. The problem I have is that you look at the situation and you find it's very difficult to believe that even the Tories want to inflict so much damage onto the country for really no gain at all, because it would be very, very easy to come to terms here. But then you realise that this is damage to our public services, which they have been deliberately inflicting for over a decade now. You might think they would care more about the economic damage, but they will be to blame for that. But if they think the economy is buggered anyway, and that they're going to lose the next election as a result of it, even that could be considered a strategic benefit. Leave Labour with the biggest mess possible. It's a desperate state of affairs when it could well be the case that it is of strategic benefit for the party of national government to preside over so much national harm. But anyway, there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.